Tonight we're very happy to have with us Mr. Robert Parris Moses and Laura Visser Maessen, and A Life in Civil Rights and Leadership at the Grassroots. Robert Parris Moses is an American educator and civil rights activist known for his work as a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee on Voter Education and Registration in Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement. Laura Visser Maessen is an assistant professor in American Studies at Utrecht University, but our very special guest to introduce her this evening is the Senior Associate Dean of the School of Law at Florida International University. Please welcome Michelle Maessen.
Well, I'm both special and a guest. That's exciting. As I said, my name is Michelle Maessen. I have the honor of hosting this event this evening, and I'm very excited and just thrilled to be presented with this opportunity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend some time and I'll go through a little bit the professor's bio, and then I have my own words, and she's going to give a presentation on working with Dr. Moses and his journey and her journey, so she'll spend some time talking about that. Then I will do a brief introduction, because none of you really came here to see me speak or hear me speak, of Dr. Moses, and then he will take the stage and talk about his journey. Okay, sounds good? We can do this? Awesome. Okay. So let me introduce, actually your bio's been given, so as opposed to me just repeating it, why don't I just have you come and take the podium and do your presentation, and we'll get started from there. Okay, Laura Visser Maessen.
Okay, well, thank you. Can everyone hear me? No? Is it? All right, like this? Closer, even closer? All right. Like this? Okay. So, well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Bob. Of course, thank you, Books and Books, and all of you for being here and for watching this at home. Well, tonight I wanted to take you back to the story of Bob Moses and the 1960s Civil Rights Movement in Mississippi by focusing on two questions that I think are the most relevant for today's times, and that drove me as a historian, but even more so as a human being, to pursue this project, and that also drove Bob into doing what he did in Mississippi and beyond. And the first revolves around the question of citizenship and finding out what kind of rights and responsibilities are attached to that, and who then is deemed worthy by society to be invested in, and what the qualifications, seriously, what the qualifications are for that. And the second question revolves around the issue of how citizens, once they've decided that their lives and their personhood matter, how they can then move to spur this along even when they're afraid. So I briefly wanted to summarize how Bob's thoughts on these questions evolved in the 60s, which is essentially what I do in my book too. Because it is a biography, but written from my interest in trying to capture the value and the pragmatics of the leadership and organizing approach that Bob personified, by describing as realistically as possible how his ideas of developing and projecting grassroots leadership materialized and how these worked in practice, and thereby sort of marry top-down and bottom-up approaches of looking at generating social change by showing how Bob, and he can tell you if he agrees with that, was a pragmatic, hands-on organizer who learned how to utilize his own skills and resources effectively to spur this along behind the scenes, while simultaneously managing to safeguard that ideal of grassroots leadership. Because when he first came to Mississippi, it wasn't so clear-cut that he would be able to move in a meaningful way. I mean, having grown up in Harlem and gone to these elite white schools like Harvard, he had no personal experience of what organizing a voter registration campaign in the rural South meant in practice. Yeah, that would be great. So, all right. I'm not touching. Okay. Can you still hear me if I talk like this? Okay. So particularly in Mississippi, where state-sponsored racism in combination with excessive racial violence had reduced activism mostly to a small number of financially independent blacks who just focused on the behind-the-scenes building of local networks and resources, because openly engaging in civil rights activity was simply too dangerous. So I discuss in the book then how Bob then learned through his meetings with these local organizers that the community mobilizing tradition that characterized civil rights protests elsewhere, that is, orchestrating these large-scale media events like marches or sit-ins, were futile in Mississippi, as was the emphasis on desegregation, since the majority of black Mississippians didn't have the money to go and, say, eat in a segregated restaurant. So the emphasis needed to be on finding a way to help the rural, disenfranchised poor gain the political clout to change their situation, although voter registration in Mississippi was just as dangerous as doing direct action. So when Bob began his first campaign in Macomb in 1961, I described how there was little he could do but experiment and take his cue from local people, and how that eventually ended up shaking up the local black and white community in an unprecedented way, even though its net results seemed negligible. He, for instance, just started with asking the local black middle class to use their networks and convince the community to support him and two other SNCC workers through donating small $5 or $10 contributions, or asking for meeting spaces to hold citizenship classes, and so on. And then with the help from local black youth, he just simply tried to gain people's trust through building these long-term personal relationships, often not mentioning voter registration at all. But unlike most, he didn't consider that campaign a failure. In one letter that he wrote in jail after some 100 black students had invited him to join him in a march to City Hall, he wrote, quote, "I am writing this note from the drunk tank of the county jail in Magnolia, Mississippi. 12 of us are here, sprawled out along the concrete bunker. In the words of Judge Brumfield, who sentenced us, we are cold calculators who designed to disrupt the racial harmony, harmonious since 1619, of Macomb. We, he said, are the leaders who are causing young children to be led like sheep to the pen to be slaughtered." End quote. But Bob then challenged this notion by recording how Hollis Watkins, who was one of the local students in lead of the march, was rocking the jail cells singing, "Michael rowed the boat ashore, hallelujah, Mississippi is next to go, hallelujah." And this, he concluded his letter, was, quote, "a tremor in the middle of the iceberg from a stone that the builders rejected," end quote. So this was the key, right? The tremor indeed had to come from locals who had learned to see themselves as initiators of social change through their personal interactions with full-time activists like Bob and others who made an effort to become part of their community. And grassroots leadership was the only logical approach, as projecting individual leaders or organizations threatened the unity and the scale of the local movement, while its survival hinged on consensus and the involvement of as many participants as possible. So in practice, this meant focusing on voting rights as the one common denominator that all groups in the local black communities could support, and to enlist the vast majority of the rural poor who other organizations like the NAACP had failed to mobilize. So from 1962 onwards, Bob and SNCC spread across Mississippi, forming these full-time volunteer groups who moved in with locals for extended periods of time and implemented that technique of developing personal relationships with locals of all social backgrounds and helping them with whatever resources, skills, manpower, education, you name it, were lacking. And they call this facilitating local leadership. That is, to give tools to locals needing help, but that they themselves should develop their own skills and leadership rather than national organizations telling them what to do and how to do it. But mostly working with sharecroppers, like the now famous Fannie Lou Hamer, taught them to take the radical position that any human being, had something worthwhile to contribute to the community, irrespective of, formal credentials like titles or wealth or level of education. So, and that they could also contribute meaningfully to the struggle and the nation as citizens, right? And that it was SNCC's job then to generate these skills in people by helping them with their initiatives, like registering to vote, becoming literate, running for political office, setting up community centers, and strengthening the organized networks that were already in place in the community. And this also meant fighting for universal voting rights, right? By eradicating the poll tax and literacy tests, right? Because otherwise voting, citizenship, would be reduced to simply an educated elite. So to give meaning to the idea that citizenship was not just a right, but that it had substance to it, Bob and the Mississippi movement worked on two levels that I describe extensively in the book. And the first is community organizing, in which they immerse themselves in the community's life and mix these sort of trial and error tactics under grassroots leadership with more sophisticated behind-the-scenes planning, like learning beforehand about a community's strength, its resources, its concerns, its needs, and its ways of conducting business. And the second was creating a sense of personhood to help locals to see themselves as legitimate agents of social change. So, for example, I describe how Fannie Lou Hamer and others like her were drawn into the movement was the way in which Bob and SNCC turned mass meetings into organizing tools in themselves, by giving participants a sense of ownership. For instance, by letting local people from the crowd come onto the stage, right, and letting them tell what they had done for the movement themselves, or they broke up the crowd in like these small groups which each discussed then a specific problem that mattered to them, and then let each group report back what solutions they themselves had came up with. So the key was thus to meet local people where they were by moving with them in a way that seemed meaningful to them and were relevant to their daily lives. And the subsequent activism of these sharecroppers then soon commanded the nation's attentions. Just think of the 1963 protest in Greenwood and the Freedom Vote, or the 1964 Freedom Days in Hattiesburg, where in which hundreds of blacks demanded to be registered. And of course, the formation of their own political party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or the MFDP, in which they then earned sort of the top-down support needed for lasting social change from key allies with resources, such as unions, lawyers, journalists, the Justice Department, and other northern white liberals. Because this then gradually became the third tenet of Bob's organizing approach. That is, a national strategy that complemented a local strategy. And this immediately also shows the complexity of how social change works in practice, because throughout 1963 and 64, he and SNCC increasingly struggled with the realization that its slow organizing approach was inadequate to combat the racial violence that had worsened after their activism, after James Meredith's integration of the University of Old Mississippi, after John F. Kennedy's proposals for a new Civil Rights Act, and of course the protests in Birmingham and elsewhere in 63. So out of these realizations then grew the 1964 Freedom Summer, which invited several hundred of northern white students to facilitate Mississippi blacks with their initiatives, such as creating freedom schools and preparing the MFDP's challenge to the seating of the regular Mississippi State Democrats at that year's Democratic National Convention. Although these projects were considered highly controversial, Freedom Summer for the fear of white retaliation, but also for the fear of what all these whites might do to that grassroots leadership that they had been building so carefully in the years before that. And the MFDP seating challenge was controversial because it foregrounded these sharecroppers like Fannie Lou Hamer and thereby directly challenged the paternalistic ideas of democracy and citizenship that many in the white liberal establishment, like President Lyndon Johnson, had, but also many black middle-class civil rights leaders. So I then address how Bob, in these struggles, managed to find a way forward in which involving the nation at large and projecting and developing grassroots leadership became mutually reinforcing goals and thereby strengthened rather than undermined grassroots leadership. So for example, I describe how he ensured that Mississippi blacks took the lead in, say, developing the platforms or speaking for the MFDP, or to let them listen in during these high-level meetings with these other civil rights leaders, like with Martin Luther King or with other Democratic Party officials. But simultaneously, I also emphasize the many crucial behind-the-scenes, nitty-gritty, day-to-day kind of activities that Bob undertook himself, to translate black Mississippians' needs and the MFDP's purpose to these Northerners with resources, and how he utilized his mediating and networking skills to subdue, at least for the time being, the inter- and intra-organizational and interracial strife that now came to explode among these various groups that were working in Mississippi. So in the final sections of the book, I discuss Bob's departure from SNCC in 1965, but show how he by then had developed an effective philosophy for social change that he then perfected over time and is now applying so successfully in the Algebra Project, of which the pictures you are seeing over there from the Miami Algebra Project. And that, he can tell you if I got this right, consists in sum of one, the idea that the people with the problem must themselves demand change. Two, that they have to do so in an organized way, embedded in their local communities. And three, that success depends on the creation of a large-scale social justice movement through participants' ability to attract key allies with resources by presenting their demands and themselves in a way that convinces themselves, as well as the people who are not directly affected by the outcome of the struggle, that theirs is what he terms an earned insurgency. And I think it's really important to repeat that message because, as I discuss in the appendix of the book, whether we're taught to see the 60s movement merely as this top-down, product that treats this movement as a sort of spontaneous, exceptional period in history that was brought about by these charismatic individuals, and through this series of marches and large-scale protests, or whether it's also presented to us as this mere climax in a long and bottom-up process of social change, that was propelled by ordinary citizens, and in which full-time civil rights leaders like Bob can be recognized as both creative instigators and mere assistants of social change, I think matters a great deal in how we go about tackling today's problems and what we imagine is possible and how we view our own role in that. So to conclude, Bob's and Snick's lessons on how you can move even if you're afraid can serve, I think, as a very powerful counter-narrative to overwhelming cynicism and feeling powerlessness about the current racial status quo, and provide a meaningful blueprint for how to move forward and create new tremors in the middle of the iceberg. And the key word I think Bob would point out is you, right? As he keeps reminding us, quote, "The main thing is not to set out with grand projects. Everything starts at your doorstep. Just deeply get involved in something. You throw a stone in one place and the ripples spread," end quote. So thank you for your attention.
So before I, don't touch the mic, before I give my introduction, I wanted to take the opportunity to share something with you. Several years ago, I got the opportunity to work with some of the kids. Can't hear me? Okay, closer. Several years ago, I got the opportunity to work with some of the students here in Miami. We actually had a Math and Civics Summer Institute that we hosted on campus at FIU, where we had 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders come to our campus and run around the building, and my dean yelled at me, and I just ignored it, and it was fine, but it was a wonderful thing. Some of the students who actually led that, the YPP students who were teachers in that program on the math side, are here tonight. I'm gonna ask y'all to stand. Yes, they're not, you can sit down. I'm so proud of them, really am. Okay, so I have my introduction. As those you know, my husband is here tonight too. Say hello, Melvin. And my colleague, Angie Friedman Ortega, works with me at the law school. This is me just giving a shout out to people, I guess. But my point is, I often decide, as they know, to go my own way when I'm asked to do things, because this is my only way that I get to be artistic and creative. And so I was offered the opportunity to give the introduction for Dr. Moses tonight. So I wrote my own. I refuse to just read a biography on the back of a page. So here's what I have to say. Excuse me. How many of us in this room would be willing to be beaten, to be jailed, to be able to continue to forge on in the face of political betrayal, to continue on as colleagues are murdered, to yourself perhaps die for a cause that you believe in, to rush headfirst into conflict? Could I? Could you? I'm speaking of not just rushing to our various Facebook pages, Instagram accounts, Twitter feeds to express our anger, moral outrage, and to talk of what others should and should not do about the problems of the world, but to put our very freedom, our own life, and perhaps the lives of our loved ones at risk, on the line for something we hold sacred, for the rights of others. Dr. Robert Parris Moses and those who stood beside him in solidarity and conflict did such a thing. Dr. Moses' life and activism epitomizes someone who has examined the turbulent, unjust world around him and said, not just that this is wrong, but did something about it. Did something about the untenable circumstances of his time, a stance that remains particularly relevant and prescient today. It is no exaggeration to say that I have been made uncomfortable, less content, more uneasy after having met and worked with Dr. Moses. I will explain briefly, and I will be brief because I'm not going to talk about myself. There are those who have come before us who have struggled, who have died, who have fought, and secured a future, a place in the world where I can stand before you and say, I'm a law school associate dean and professor, a woman, an African American, and share my thoughts and feelings with you about Dr. Moses. And equally as important, an eclectic group of folks in this room with your own histories, your own passions, your own goals, would care to listen and celebrate Dr. Moses and his life. The hard-fought history and magnitude of the moment is not lost on me. I believe the same can be said for those of you present tonight. There are opportunities and conflicts that flow from occupying such a space, standing on such a platform where Dr. Moses is present in this room. I encourage you to sit with that, to wrestle with this moment of import and its symbolism. As you listen and reflect upon tonight's featured speakers, the professor, Dr. Moses. I first met Dr. Moses almost 7 years ago when I'd organized my law school symposium featuring the doctor, several panels of lawyers, community activists, parents, and children from the community, as we addressed the issue of education as a constitutional right. My own arrogance and lack of awareness as to just who Dr. Moses is and was, and what he has sacrificed in the name of racial and social justice, as we discuss programmatic details, retrospectively is something that I will never forget. This is an oversight that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and attempting to atone for as I move through my own professional choices and decisions. In my administrative haste, I did not pause to listen and understand when he spoke of the value and necessity for grassroots activism. Communities must play a central role, an active role in their own destinies. What I didn't know, didn't understand in that moment, didn't believe, and couldn't hear is the resolution of the multitude of problems being faced then and certainly now in this country, and particularly the struggles of the working class, the poor, will not be resolved solely by a traditional hierarchical top-down leadership structure. Leadership must be about facilitating the agency of others, organizing and getting out of the way. I get it. I understand it now. Having worked with him and doing my own work in the community, the ways and whys of this are discussed more fully in Dr. Moses' biography. Also lost on me, and what I will share with you as a final thought is this. Earlier I spoke of personal discomfort and unease. This state, this feeling flows from an attempt to ascribe some meaning to my own role in this community, in this world. Having met Dr. Moses, learned of his life's work, his sacrifice, what do I owe the community, given my own experiences, my own opportunities, my own blessings? What legacy will I leave behind? Will it be one that I'm proud of, much like Dr. Moses' journey? I also pose the same to all of you. Given today's realities, locally, nationally, globally, what will you endeavor to do to make this world a better place? What will be your legacy? I respectfully suggest that the framework, the guide for addressing this question, as you formulate your own truths and answers, can be found in Dr. Moses' biography. So I'm going to turn it over to you, sir.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. How are you doing? So Charlie Cobb is here. Can you stand up? Right. So it was Freedom Schools was Charlie's idea, and Charlie was with us in SNCC, and he and I are still part of a SNCC legacy group, right? So what I thought I would do is try to bring the discussion up to date, right? And the SNCC Legacy Group decided that we should make a presentation to the Democratic Platform Committee. And so I did go out to Phoenix in June, where the Platform Committee met and read a statement. And the statement kind of gives a framework that we might use to look at both what happened back in 50 years ago and what's happening now, right? And so if you don't mind, I'd like to read that, right? To you. In March of 1963, a field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I testified in the Federal District Court of Judge Claude Clayton in Greenville, Mississippi, with my lawyer, John Doerr, from the U.S. Department of Justice. A few months earlier, Jimmy Travis, Randolph Blackwell, and I had been grease-gunned on the highway outside of Greenwood. Jimmy, driving, caught a bullet in his neck. In response to this terrorist act, SNCC converged on Greenwood, raised food from Chicago, and insisted that families needing food join the right to vote insurgency, march with SNCC to the courthouse, and attempt to register. Greenwood police arrested and jailed 8 SNCC field secretaries. From the witness stand, I stared at the sharecroppers bust there from Greenwood while attending to Judge Clayton's constitutional question. Why is SNCC taking illiterates down to register to vote? Because the nation can't have its cake and eat it too. It can't use politics to deny black people access to literacy and then turn around and say they can't do politics because they're illiterate. Today, more than 50 years later, a contemporary SNCC action might provoke a contemporary constitutional question. Why is SNCC taking convicted felons down to register to vote? In that 1963 Mississippi Federal District Court and in 21st century America, 3 sets of constitutional combatants engage each other in a power struggle for the right to vote and the right to a quality public school education. Federal power, state power, and people power. 3 powers which have struggled with each other across each of 3 constitutional eras. Each of these eras has distinctive badges. We can see this in the fate of young black men across the 3 eras. The first era, 1787 to 1862. In the first constitutional era, young black men are Africans and constitutional property, too valuable to lynch or to lock up. The second, from 1875 to 1941. In the second constitutional era, Southern young black men are second-class citizens, rounded up by the tens of thousands for peonage and shackled to work the coal mines. In this, our third constitutional era, mass incarceration, fueled by President Nixon's determination to create a war on drugs as a tool to destroy the black community, intensified under the Clinton and Obama administrations, decimated the potential black electorate. The National Democratic Party, authors of all 3 devastations, cannot claim innocence. Because as Baldwin taught us, it's not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It's the innocence which constitutes the crime. That said, we are calling on the National Democratic Party to address with us two fundamental questions. Who are the constitutional people? What does it mean to be a constitutional person in the United States of America? On April 22, 1820, at the center of the first constitutional era, Thomas Jefferson wrote this to John Holmes about slavery. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other. In that era, Democrat presidents decimated Native Americans, confiscated their lands, and rode the wolf of slavery. Young black Africans, insurgent runaway slaves, inspired a revolutionary people's movement to destroy the wolf of slavery, pushing Abraham Lincoln to begin his 1858 House divided speech, 1858 House divided speech, with reflections on the two-letter word that in this very election cycle continues to confound this nation. If we could first know where we stand, where we are, and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it. Alas, Lincoln could not construct a we. The nation fractured and descended into war. It took its own sweet time, but Democrats fractured over the same two-letter word when 1 century after the Civil War, Freedom Summer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, pushed the National Democratic Party to cleanse itself from the politics of white supremacy. MFDP had come from the right state. George Boutwell, a senator from Massachusetts who helped craft the Reconstruction Amendments and the laws to enforce them, stated the case in the Boutwell report. The evidence shows that the state of Mississippi is at present under the control of political organizations composed largely of armed men whose common purpose is to establish and maintain by acts of violence, fraud, and murder the supremacy of the white line democracy. In 1875, a decade after the Civil War, a Democrat Party's white line democracy launched the nation into Jim Crow and slavery by another name. Black youth dropped the curtain on this second congressional era. They initiated and sustained the sit-in movement, took it across Alabama and into Mississippi with freedom rides, then settled via SNCC across Mississippi and the Black Belt to organize and earned insurgency for the right to vote. They acted as constitutional people, citizens of the nation, in defiance of the nation's Confederate narrative and its idea that their human rights depended on something as shaky as the laws of Confederate states, a notion as absurd as slavery itself. They enacted a people's narrative, a story involving guarantees of national citizenship and national protection of citizens' rights. In this third constitutional era, our questions remain. Who are the constitutional people? What does it mean to be a constitutional person in the United States of America? While those who fought for the Reconstruction Amendments thought they were guaranteeing the right to vote to all citizens, those rights have been deeply undermined by, among others, this Democratic Party. In 1963, Judge Wisdom of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals had this to say about the removal in 1877 of federal troops from the South. These events foreshadowed the lily-white primary and marked the emergence of the Democratic Party in the South as the institutionalized incarnation of the will to white supremacy. In Shelby County versus Holder, Chief Justice Roberts elevated a Confederate narrative of states' rights over a people's narrative of universal citizenship, providing a judicial facade for the contemporary will to white supremacy. To reinforce the intent and purpose of the Reconstruction Amendments, and to ensure that all of our citizens, including incarcerated persons, have full political rights, the SNCC Legacy Project and those of us who commit to organizing earned insurgencies of people's power champion, in opposition to Chief Justice Roberts, a people's narrative, that the nation rejected both slavery and its assault on human dignity and altered its slave-tolerating constitution to give to the federal government power to protect people's rights. We ask that the National Democratic Party take a revolutionary stance, confirm the right to vote, and make it explicit. Adopt in your platform the following statement. The National Democratic Party agrees to work for the following voting rights resolution. Voting rights resolution. Section 1. The people's right of representation being necessary to our Republican form of government, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be infringed. Section 2. The federal branches of government shall protect this right. That's the end. So 50 years after we were working for the right to vote, we are back asking the country to actually change the Constitution and give us an affirmative constitutional right to vote in the same way as we have an affirmative right to bear arms, right? Right? So the Second Amendment is an affirmative right to bear arms. The right to bear arms shall not be infringed, right? So we do not have an affirmative constitutional right to vote, right? And so we went before the Platform Committee asking that the Democratic Party actually, in its platform, adopt a resolution for the right to vote. Notice Section 2. The 15th Amendment says, is the enforcement provision of the voting rights, right, that are in the 15th Amendment. And remember, the 15th Amendment says that the states shall not interfere, right, on the basis of race, right, or some other qualifications, right, and that this should be enforced by the Congress. What we're saying here is that all branches of government shall protect the right to vote, right? The courts, including the Supreme Court, the executive branch, and the legislative branch, right? So we want an amendment which says that the right to vote is constitutionally protected, it's a human right, and that all the federal branches of government shall protect this right to vote. So So that's one sort of line of battle that I think this generation has to work on. The other has to do with their education, and so I'd like to back up and get into the issue of the education. The young people from the Miami Alder Project and the YPP, could you not only stand, you just come up and say your names for us, and that will help get back up into that. Glad you're going to come up to. And you just say your name and anything else you want to talk to us about a little. Not too long, but.
My name is Andrew. I'm actually part of both cohorts, the APP and the YPP. I mean, AP and YPP, correction. The Beyond Equal program has taught me a lot. It basically taught me how to basically open and be able to speak and voice my opinion about certain things, especially when it comes to standing up for myself. They allowed me to do that, and they allowed me to express that in the program. So.
Hello, I'm Victoria Foster. Hi, my name is Wilkins Desire. Hermit Pierre.
My name is Glad Lynette, and I'm a member of Adru Project and the YPP. They have taught me how to work with kids. I wasn't really too good with kids, so I really enjoyed it.
Roberto Sincere, a member of YPP and the Adru Project. Glad to be here tonight.
Hello, my name is Stephen Nicholas, YPP and AP, and I just want to tell you guys this program is great. If you want to develop a group of youth, possible members of the future or anything, and I say invest in us and the children that you want.
So, Berto, they don't know that you and Irma are the parents. Don't want to introduce your baby to everybody, Irma. Yeah. And his mother is? All right. Yeah, thanks. So in the spring of 1963, I was on the witness stand, as it says here, and the issue about illiteracy and voting raised the question of sharecropper education. In other words, a whole people had been assigned a certain kind of work, and so they got the education appropriate for the work to which they had been assigned, right? So the issue of sharecropper education raised its head in the Rodriguez versus San Antonio case in around 1970, 69, 68, 71. In 1968, 400 Mexican-American students marched out of their high school onto the school system, demanding a better school and teachers. Their mothers took it to court, and it ended up in the Supreme Court in a case called Rodriguez versus San Antonio. So Justice Powell was the Chief Justice, and he wrote the opinion and said, look, you cannot come to the federal courts for equity relief because there is no substantive constitutional right to an education, right? And the operative word was substantive, right? So after that, the whole legal profession right, switched tactics and went state by state. So there are currently 45 cases in 45 states in this country around issues of equity and education, right? The Campaign for Fiscal Equity filed a suit in New York State, right, and asked that the city of New York be given more money, right? So a federal district judge, DeGrasse, said yes, right? The state should pay more money to the city. Pataki, who was the Republican government, appealed. And he got a 4-judge panel which said no. And the reason they said no is that the state of New York in its constitution is required to educate young people to do 2 things: serve on juries and vote. And they said that an 8th grade education is enough to do that. Yes, indeed, right? All of the students are receiving an equivalent of an 8th grade education, so there's no need for more money, right? Now, one of the judges said, look, there are a lot of low-paying jobs, right? People who have these low-paying jobs only need a certain kind of education, right? It is the 21st century version of sharecropper education. It's going on in front of our noses, right? Right. So the whole issue of education and what it means today, in terms of these constitutional eras, right? If you look at the first constitutional era, the industry which undergirded it was agriculture, right? And we were mopping up land and murdering Native Americans to get their land east of the Mississippi right up until the Civil War, right? In the second constitutional era, the industry which undergirded it was industrial technology, right? And there was the need for labor, right? And so there was the Circular 3591. Do you know that circular? You should Google it, right? You can just Google it. Circular 3591. It was issued by Attorney General Biddle, who was Roosevelt's Attorney General, and he issued it on December 12, 1941. And he instructed every state prosecuting attorney that they should no longer prosecute debt as peonage. They should prosecute it as involuntary servitude or slavery. So what was going on? Well, what was going on was Pearl Harbor and World War II, right? And Roosevelt had figured out that he needed young black men, right? And so he instructed his attorney general to stop the practice of rounding up young black men on charges of vagrancy and not having any money and sending them off to the coal mines, right? So that was the second constitutional era. In our constitutional era, the planet has transitioned from industrial to information age technology, right? And what is at stake now is the work that's driving the economy is some form of knowledge work, right? And so the issue of education is back on the table, and the young people who don't get the education that's needed to give them access to knowledge work, they are being sent to jail now. There's no work for them, right? So the solution that's being played out in front of our eyes is they are being said it's mass incarceration, right? So the whole issue of education is back on the table. So I came to think of the Mississippi movement as a theater of guerrilla warfare. It was kind of low-grade guerrilla warfare. And in guerrilla warfare, you have a base, a community base, in which you can disappear and keep your sanity. And then you emerge from there and do your actions, right? We also had to earn our guerrilla warfare. So this idea of insurgencies in this country and how you earn them, in those 50 years ago, our first task was to earn the insurgency in the eyes of the actual people we were working with, right? The farmers, the day laborers, right? The sharecroppers. We had to earn the right to ask them to put their own lives and their family lives in danger, right? So basically, the strategy was straightforward. You get knocked down, you get back up. And if you got knocked down enough times and got back up enough times, then they figured out that you were for real, that you weren't just trying to put a scam on somebody, right? So we earned that right. We got their understanding of the work that we were doing as something that they can and should join us in. The second group, we had to earn the right of the Justice Department to get us out of jail, because you're operating in a state in which the state itself is the enemy, right? And so from the highway patrolman to the sheriff to the Ku Klux Klan, it didn't matter. The whole apparatus of the state, they had their own intelligence operation, the Sovereignty Commission, right? So there was always, you were always under surveillance, right? So in 1957, you remember who was president? Anybody? Eisenhower, right. Eisenhower's president, and the Senate Majority Leader is Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas. So Eisenhower and Johnson put together the Civil Rights Act, the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction, right? And they have in mind Tuskegee professors who are qualified to vote under anybody's standard, right? That they should be allowed to vote. They don't have SNCC in mind, right? But in any case, they write in there that the state cannot harass or jail people trying to register to vote or people trying to help them register to vote. So when we arrived as SNCC in Mississippi in 1960 and 61, right, that little piece of legislation becomes our kind of, what I came to think of as our legal crawl space, right? It actually allows us to do the work because you can't do the work from the jail cell, right? And the freedom rides and the direct action that came into Mississippi, they were faced with doing the Nelson Mandela, right? There was no legal protection. They were faced with long-term jail sentences, right? But because of the Civil Rights Act of '57, we were actually, every time we got arrested, as soon as we figured out that what we were going to do was just voter registration, then the presumption when you got arrested was you got arrested because you were doing voter registration. And so the Justice Department would come in and get us out of jail, right? So but you had to earn the right for them to do that because it didn't say that they were required to do it, right? It was just that they were permitted to do it, right? The third group that we had to earn the right, as Laura mentioned, we called on the whole country to come take a closer look at itself in Mississippi, and we had to earn the right to do that, right? They came after us to saying that we were going to trying to start another civil war in this country, right? But they couldn't make it stick because of the work that we had done, right? So the question of how we have an earned insurgency around education is before us, right? Guerrilla warfare. So I think the country is still in a state of guerrilla warfare, right? And so we are on the nonviolent end of that warfare, the Algebra Project, the Young People's Project. If the country had any sense at all, it would be supporting us big time, right? Because the violent end of that guerrilla warfare has started to emerge, right? And the country, the idea that the country can get away with an education system which locks young people into a future where they really cannot access the economic arrangements which are driving the country. It's the current constitutional era's version of what happened in the previous constitutional eras, right? But being trapped in the cities, it won't be pretty. So I think Miami should support the young people. I think there are people here from FIU. Joni Wynn is here. Joni, do you want to stand up? So Joni came over to Mississippi. She read about the work we were doing in Mississippi. She came over to Mississippi as the century began, and then set up a way for the Algebra Project to come to Miami. And our first cohort of students were the students you just saw. The students who came up here were part of the Algebra Project from 2006 to 2010 at Edison High School, right? And we worked with them as they went through high school, right? And they are regrouping now because they are interested in carrying forward some of the work of the Algebra Project as the time goes on, right? So I don't know, Michelle, do you want to, I don't know if there's time for people to ask questions.
There are lots of questions in the audience. What I'm going to ask Professor Visser Mason to do is to join you.
Okay.
Questions? Yes, ma'am. Do you need a mic, right? Actually, I'll give you this. Okay, just so we can record.
I'm so pleased that you came. What do you suggest now with Black Lives Matter and the movements here? What, based on your experiences, what do you suggest that they do differently or advice you give them?
So Charlie, Charlie, you know, the SNCC Legacy has been trying to develop a cross-generational, right, conversation that's just at ground zero, right, in terms of actually talking with them. But Charlie actually has followed up. We had a meeting last fall, or last fall at Duke. So do you want to fill us in?
Really, I don't. No, I won't. I mean, because really, I think the conversation should belong to Bob and Laura. There is a conversation to hold about Black Lives Matter. I will say only one thing, and it's not just true for Black Lives Matter. It's true for a group like Dream Defenders here in Florida, or Moral Mondays in North Carolina, that whole generation of young activists. What they're grappling with now is what beyond protests should they do? It's the organizing question. We had to confront it at SNCC, and they're wrestling with it now. Protest is necessary, but not sufficient. So how and where and what do we organize for at the grassroots?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so my question really is, you're talking about education and how that was really their excuse for not allowing voting. Now, this is going to be the first presidential election since the Voting Rights Act has not been upheld. What's going to happen?
So somebody want to answer that question? The question is, what's going to happen now, right?
They told me we're not all disenfranchised, can't vote.
Right, yes. So it's a question about the actual situation now vis-a-vis voting, and probably we should focus on Florida, right? And hanging, what was it? Hanging something? Hanging chads, right? So does someone want to open up the question about Florida and voting, and what do you think is going to happen? Anybody got some ideas?
Well,
Because I'm not from Florida.
but here you're not required, you already, it's not that you need your photo ID or whatever, anything is difficult to get, that's not that kind of requirement here. This state, there could be other problems, but that's not one of them.
So what do you think is going to happen?
I think a lot of people aren't gonna be able to vote, or won't even try,
Why?
because they don't have the proper, quote unquote, I say the word proper, because that's what the states are saying. They don't have the ID, they can't get it, no way to get it. Especially what they're asking for, it's no different than a poll tax or anything else.
Well, we will be fighting for 100 years as long as we have the current constitutional status about voting, right? Where the states really, now thanks to the Roberts Court,
That's what I'm
right?
saying, right?
And the Roberts Court is really resurrecting the Confederate narrative. Remember, the Confederate narrative goes back to 1883, right? When the Supreme Court decided that it would respond to the Congress Civil Rights Act, right? The Reconstruction Congress Civil Rights Act, by saying that it's the states which have the actual duty and responsibility for saying the civil rights of the people in the states should be. Notice that in the first constitutional era, right, from 1787 down to the Civil War, right, there was no such thing as the right of the states over this issue, because the issue at stake then was the plantation's owner's right to recover his property, right? So when the property decided to own itself and run away, right, to another state, right, it didn't matter that that state said, you can't come in here, right? The federal government, right, and it's the first section in the Constitution, remember 423, Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3, right? It's the article in the Constitution which says that there is something called constitutional property, right? And this property can be recovered by its owner, right? And that was reinforced with further legislation, right?
But I guess the real problem is also, when we talk about federal elections, why should the state have a right to say that everybody should be able to do the same thing across the states for a federal election? What you do in your local elections are that's a separate issue. I think that's a big problem.
What is the idea that people cannot get? Can you explain it, please?
So why don't you
Yeah.
pose one last question or comment, and
Okay.
then we have to make a switch, but we're going to continue to discuss this. But then,
Okay, I'm glad you brought up the hanging chads scenario, because that really went to the question I wanted to ask. I thought the statement that you and the group drafted for the program, I'm sorry, the platform committee to consider, it made a very strong case for all the, legal foundation for there to be some kind of guarantee of access, to the polls, not impeding registration and not impeding voting itself. I'm wondering if there's any kind of federal protection for the other half of that, which is once you have voted, can there be some guarantee that your vote will be counted and that there will be a fair election? And I think, I still think that my vote in 2000 never got counted. And we have this, there was this painful scenario you'll remember in 2004. We had the smoking gun evidence of this corporate memo from the Diebold Corporation to the Republican Party. Get your government to buy our voting machines and we'll guarantee that you will win. And the Democrats were just, or the Democrats as I call them, didn't even, respond. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of, the same way you were able to search out the legal foundation for the right to vote, are there any precedents or anything that can address whether we will actually have free and fair elections?
Right, so the question of not only voting, but that the vote should count. So Michelle and the legal team here are going to help us figure out that question.
So what we're going to do, we have to switch over. I don't want
now.
anyone to leave. We just have to end the taping, I assume. Is that what we need to do? You have some closing remarks. But I think we have a good conversation going. The last time Dr. Moses and I were in a room, we actually had our summer program that grew out of that because we never let people leave without a task. And so I'll turn it over to him and then we'll come back.
Thank you. Thanks, folks, again, for showing up tonight. We really appreciate it. For those online, don't forget you can always give us a call, and we'll get a book signed for you and autograph it for you. And before you leave, of course, you want to sit here. We're going to continue this conversation. It's very important. Can we please just get a round of applause for everybody that's been here for this up to this point? Thank you so much. For the benefit of our live stream audience that can't be here to experience this, I appreciate that. So we're going to say goodnight to our live stream audience, but you all stay put. Let's continue with the questions. Thank you.
Actually have a